Hello everyone, and welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at the news, topics, and events that are going on in your world today. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online academic community for everyone who is interested and active in the field of depth and Jungian psychologies. Depth Psychology Alliance is growing quite quickly and profoundly, and so it's very exciting to see what's going on in the community. And if you're interested, I invite you to come and join us. It's free to join, and the place you can find that is at www.depthpsychologyalliance.com. Meanwhile, I'm very excited for my guest today. Dr. Arlene Landau is an author, a new author, in fact, and we're going to talk about her book, which is quite a fascinating topic and something that I think is extremely relevant and important in our culture today. To tell you a little bit about Dr. Landau, she received her diploma in Analytical Psychology from the C.J. Jung Institute of Los Angeles. She also received a Ph.D. in Mythological Studies in Depth Psychology from Pacifica Graduate Institute, which many of our listeners are familiar with. Dr. Landau also holds a Bachelor of Arts in Art and a Master of Arts in Educational Psychology. This is quite interesting because when I began looking at her book, almost everything that she has studied seems to come together into this book. Dr. Landau, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Well, let's talk about your book, because this is a fascinating topic to me, and I absolutely love the cover. Hopefully people will be able to see that when they go to download the link for this particular interview online. But it's quite an intriguing cover, and of course it's an intriguing topic as well. The title of the book is Tragic Beauty, The Dark Side of Venus Aphrodite and the Loss and Regeneration of Soul. And we're going to talk about this. Well, actually, I look at it as kind of an archetypal aspect, I guess, of our culture. But you tell me, Dr. Landau, what gravitated you toward this topic? Do you look at this as the Venus Aphrodite as an archetype, or is she really much more of a character trait in us? Tell us what your take is on this and how you actually ended up writing this book.
In my view, we are born with definite, let's say as women and men too, archetypal structures, I think from birth. And not everybody's is as definite. But in my case, I was sort of born with Aphrodite engraved in my psyche. And then one, acts out that way or lives that way, generally without much consciousness. And it can be an extremely painful way to live.
Why is that? I do know that you had mentioned somewhere that women who embody the Aphrodite archetype have less choice in how they behave or react than other people really imagine that to be. And because you identify yourself with this archetype as well, maybe you can speak to that a little bit, because I suspect that if that's the case, it's probably causing quite a lot of pain for many, many women in our culture.
Yes, it's true, and not only does one have not much choice living out the Aphrodite archetype, but the other ones as well. But I think the others may not be as painful. And an example would be Artemis, and you might see her, when you go to the zoo, and she's maybe mucking out the stalls, and she's perhaps only 35 years old, but she's already very wrinkly and doesn't wear sunblock or a hat, and her hair is already gray, and she's the goddess of the wilderness, or, at home with animals. So her life may be just as one-sided, but the women who are born with Aphrodite, they're the ones who are very over the top, and you'll see them wherever, in the market, or with the sparkly belt and earrings down to their shoulders and long blonde hair with extensions and even in old age. So they're the ones that people tend to often make fun of because it can be so over the top, or the sparkly shoes or the 5-inch heels, no matter how far they have to walk. Mm-hmm. So they're, in a way, the most vulnerable. And then often, as they age, let's say Liz Taylor would be an example, and when they start to lose their beauty, they often develop a lot of physical symptoms and stay home.
So probably it would be a good idea just to go back and iterate. I'm sure most people know this, but of course the archetype of Venus Aphrodite is really about love and beauty. And what I hear you gravitating toward in that is the idea of beauty. And I think at first glance, most people would not say they're the women that are being made fun of. They may be the ones that are envied. But what I really hear you talking about is the shadow side of the Venus Aphrodite archetype, and the fact that in our culture, a lot of times when a person is very physically attractive, sometimes we tend to objectify more, or we're intimidated, or we forget that they have the same kind of feelings that can be easily hurt as everybody else. And so even though on one hand we may look at people that are physically attractive and feel either envy or feel like they have everything that they could want or feel that they're lucky, there's also a piece of it where because they can't really help themselves for going over the top, as you mentioned, that they also are in a very vulnerable kind of position.
Yes, that's exactly it. Very well said.
And I would imagine, too, that part of the challenge for these women who carry the Aphrodite type is the way that they interact with men. Are there certain types of men, do you think, that are attracted to these kind of glittery Aphrodite types?
I think so. In my experience, there's two main types, and one is the type who resembles the god Ares. And in the mythological tales of Aphrodite, he is the one who is in bed with her. And so an Ares type fellow might be, someone in the Marines or the Army, and very mesomorph and sort of like a Zeus powerful personality and a fighter. And when you often see a guy like that, and then you'll see like an Aphrodite type next to him with their high heels sort of clippity-cloppeting along. So that's one type. And another type can be a man who's extremely mild, what I sometimes call a pink man. And an example of this, which I do talk about in the book, is a man I once worked with who was a massage therapist, didn't make much money, lived very modestly, and he went to Oaxaca and fell madly in love with a prostitute and basically gave her all his money. And then she took him to meet her so-called family. This is the type of thing she's, of course, done over and over again with her victims. And then he went there 2-3 times, and the third time she was gone. He couldn't find her anymore. So here, his inner woman is very, very far away, thus in a different land, or these guys who go to Bangkok, and they find these very beautiful but impossible women that they really can't have a relationship with, and the women end up bossing them around and so forth.
Right. It sounds like the kind of person that really ends up giving over themselves to this kind of idealized woman that they really can't attain, at least in the condition that they're in, without doing some of their own inner work to shift that. Right.
Exactly. Yes.
So, Arlene, I know that you are a Jungian analyst, and clearly you have a tremendous amount of knowledge about the pantheon, the Greek mythology. I know you have the Ph.D. in mythology from Pacifica, but there's something about this that's very personal for you because, again, you've identified yourself with some of the challenges that Aphrodite women have. How did your journey of discovering this kind of typology and where this lives in yourself lead you to become a Jungian analyst? Because that's part of the story, right?
Yes, it is. That's, of course, a huge question. I'll try to put the little pieces together. My dad was an amateur Shakespearean authority. So as a child, the most important thing was to read books, and that was the highest value coming from him. So as a very young person, I was reading like Hermann Hesse and Thomas Hardy and Steinbeck and very archetypal books, but of course I knew nothing about archetypes at all. And then when I graduated high school, I didn't know what to do, and I had an uncle who was a famous cinematographer, and they said, well, we'll get you into the movies. So that's what I did all through my teens and 20s. And, I was very pretty, and a lot of guys were hitting on me, and I was pretty depressed, and not clinically depressed, but I would say miserable. So I decided to go at that time to see a psychiatrist, and it was a famous Freudian analyst who never asked me about dreams. And after about a year, I found it enormously unhelpful. And he said I was like a brick wall. And then accidentally I found a Jungian. I'd never heard of Jung at the time. And the first thing he did was tell me a fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty. And what he meant, instead of the outer man saving me, the inner man would break through the thorns. And the kingdom, meaning the inner kingdom and my life, would come alive. And within 6 months, I decided I wanted to be an analyst. I mean, it just absolutely, being in this analysis was a numinous experience, which, as you know, means the nod of God. So I continued my journey and on years and years to take, as you probably know, post-licensing, like of a MFT, or if you're a psychiatrist, whatever one is, then it's another at least 7 years to get through training as a Jungian analyst. So it's an endless process.
Yeah, that's a big commitment on your part, but because you seem to realize so quickly that that's what you wanted to do, and also because you found the Jungian analyst completely synchronistically. It almost feels like there was something much bigger at work in all of this process that was really leading you down that path. Of course, James Hillman talks about that a lot, about how there's this thing that's pulling us forward into our future. And perhaps as a young and quite beautiful woman, when you were in high school and as a young adult and in early adulthood, you may never have pictured yourself on this path. And yet the very thing that engaged you on some level was that you were kind of intrigued, or you were brought in at first by a story, by a fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty. I find that to be quite poignant, actually. I have a question for you, because I know that you had the opportunity, and you're so fortunate to have studied with Edward Edinger for several years, and most people know
10 years, actually.
Yeah, so that's a long time, and he's quite a profound scholar of Jung's work. Was there some influence from him on this whole archetypal perspective? Was that training with him something that you started after you already understood a bit about the archetype? Because I know that Edinger often links Aphrodite with the Holy Spirit or the Holy Ghost or the dove. It's much more of a spiritual aspect of things.
Well, there's certainly that aspect. Well, when I was fortunate enough, when Edward Edinger lived here, I was already in training to be a Jungian analyst. I already was accepted into the Institute. So I was one of many candidates and analysts who were allowed to be in his seminars, which he held every year. So by that time, I was somewhat versed in Jungian psychology and had already a great deal of analysis, which is the best way to learn about it. So he was such a wonderful teacher and so clear, and he made Jung's volumes very understandable. And he actually does have a book about the goddesses called The Eternal Drama, which is wonderful to read.
Yes, that's a remarkable book. So coming back to this whole idea, I'm still very intrigued by what I see as kind of the polar opposites, the two sides that make up the Venus-Aphrodite archetype. And as we know, when we get Jungian training or in-depth psychology, we understand that all archetypes have these polarities, these two polarities. And so kind of playing off of this idea of Aphrodite having the spiritual aspect, and then coming back to your title, which is Tragic Beauty. That's such an interesting term because you're talking about the dark side. And then I also know that you have a lecture specifically called Aphrodite's Shadow in Beverly Hills and Hollywood. So I'm just trying to put this all together and understand how the archetype of Venus-Aphrodite is showing up in our culture today. And I certainly see it when I look at entertainment news on TV or all the celebrity news that we seem to have such a fixation about. Can you just talk a little bit about maybe that lecture or how you see that the shadow shows up in that particular arena?
Yes, and started with, I will say, a conference in L.A. called Myths of L.A. when I first put some of this material together, which was 2004. I think because of my experience working in Hollywood, because I worked as a very minor actor, extra, etc., for so long I just saw the dark side. And, of course, a very familiar example would be Anna Nicole Smith, who, judging by her appearance and the many men, was so identified with Aphrodite, and often these women don't live very long. So there's, of course, the beauty and the spirituality and these other qualities, but there is the dark side, and I think Karenye speaks of Aphrodite who dances on the graves.
Right. Yes, and I see as well that there could be this idea of wanting to obtain that ideal. The word that keeps coming to me is ideal. And so I see when we look at the issues of body image and all the cosmetic surgery that are happening and all of the things that we see on TV, a lot of young people, and I guess even older people, look into this unattainable ideal, and it seems like as a culture we are just moving more and more to that sort of searching to try to achieve that. And yet, as we're just discussing now, not only is it not something that we probably can achieve, but it's also not something that we would want to achieve if we really understood the archetype from an aspect of fullness.
Yes. It's funny, an analyst once said how if you're at a party and you see someone, they say, "Oh, you look great, you haven't changed." And he said that really is the worst thing one could say to you. So this pursuit of looking the same and surgeries up till 90 years old. And the women who are really stuck with Aphrodite and don't have any access to other goddesses, they just can't stop.
Yes, and I'm wondering, you kind of alluded to this idea of you being able to, through the guidance of the Jungian analyst that you were seeing early on, this guidance toward finding your own inner masculine figure that could fulfill or meet the Aphrodite part of yourself wholly. And part of the title, the subtitle of your book, is The Loss and Regeneration of Soul. So what do you feel is I don't know if you can say solution because it's never as black and white as a problem and a solution, but how do you think that people in our culture who are struggling with identifying with this Aphrodite or know somebody that is could either come to terms with it or do something to bring about some much-needed transformation?
Yeah, very good question. I really feel the only thing that works is a good Jungian analysis, and I don't feel regular therapy works on this, maybe somewhat, but you have to get to the dreams, active imagination, images, and really get inside. And, of course, the person has to be willing to commit to this, and it takes many years to find other aspects of one's psyche.
Yeah, I think really being able to look at something from a symbolic standpoint, a mythological standpoint, to understand the story that each of us are living out, no matter which archetype it is that we're identified with, or which one we're identified with at any particular time in our lives, because clearly we go through cycles and we live out different stories, but understanding the characters in the story and being able to develop a relationship with them and then to be able to move on and actually maybe, I don't want to say we have control over our lives because we don't always, but sometimes we have the opportunity to influence or maybe, again, going back to that word engage, to engage with what's happening in our lives in a way that will allow us to enter in relationship with it, and then that transformation can happen.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
It takes so much hard work. It helps to, of course, read the books and understand the archetypal structure, and certainly that's one of the reasons. I wrote my book because I had to write it, and hopefully it could be of some help, but it's really an analysis that makes a change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's lovely to hear you talk about that, and certainly validates, I think, a lot of what most of us believe about really just needing to do the inner work. A lot of us in this community, and anybody who's listening to this, there's probably a reason for it. And it's because we are more willing to start engaging in that process of self-reflection and looking at our lives and trying to understand our relationship to ourselves and the world at large. And you're right, the power of being able to be guided through this by somebody who has studied Jung's work in particular is quite a remarkable process and powerful by all means.
And who's been analyzed themselves.
Right, exactly, yes. Because, of course, that is a requirement for all Jungian analysts to go through a long process, as you mentioned. Can you talk to us about your writing process? Because your book, Tragic Beauty, is hot off the press. So you must be quite excited about having it come out. But I wonder what the writing process was like that led up to this, and how you actually got to the point where it was finished and ready to be published.
Painful. That's how I would describe it. But I think in some ways, actually, it started with going to Pacifica, and as you know, went after I was already a certified Jungian analyst, and that's very rare. I don't know anyone else who was already certified who was willing to do that. So my dissertation was just like 300 pages, a Jungian commentary on Thomas Hardy's novels Return of the Native, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and Jude the Obscure. So that was obviously quite a project. And so that kind of started me off having to do that. And because for me, writing is a painful process. Some people, can't wait to sit down and do their many blogs and so forth and so on, but that is not my case. Mm-hmm. So Pacifica was a great help to me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, sometimes having that kind of a container where you have the pathway sort of laid ahead of you and you can move from one step to the next is powerful. And I think that also goes back to the whole idea of therapy and seeing an analyst, because it provides that container which enables us to take that next step. You've been an analyst now for quite some time, since 1995. Yes. And I'm wondering if you have advice for people who would like to become a therapist or to pursue the path that you have pursued as a Jungian analyst.
My advice is to find a certified Jungian analyst or someone in training, and the C.G. Jung Institute, there's a list, there's a low-fee clinic, and to really find someone who's good and who is in this process or has completed it. Because I have, it sounds terrible, but I have a number of patients who had very long-term therapy with other sorts of therapists, and it was not effective. Many Jungians, to get through training, one really knows a lot and has been through their own process. And there's Jungian institutes really all over the world. So that's my advice. I'm now doing Skype with potential Jungian analysts in Romania.
So actually, rather than doing it in person, you're using technology to be able to do it by video.
Yes. Well, there is not one Jungian analyst in all of Romania.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in technology, and I think that's kind of a fine line. And, of course, coming back to the way that we're connected, you and I, literally today, here we are. We're doing this from different locations completely, but we still have the capacity to connect on a certain level. And, of course, Depth Psychology Alliance, which is the community that is online. And so there's always this challenge between sort of adopting the technology that allows us to connect, but still being able to maintain that personable and that authentic connection. Do you find that is not too difficult to be able to do when you do Skype conferences with therapy?
It works pretty well. It's pretty amazing. And I do phone sessions with people, too. Also, nothing's, of course, like in person.
Right.
But it does work.
Well, I'll say, Dr. Landau, you have come a long way from being the sort of uninitiated young woman who identified with being physically beautiful to coming into this role of caring for others and guiding them through a process in which they can become authentic themselves. And it's really lovely. It's a true testament of the power of the whole Jungian process. And I'm so looking forward to finishing your book. The book is Tragic Beauty, The Dark Side of Venus Aphrodite and the Loss and Regeneration of Soul. Anyone who would like to know more about Tragic Beauty or about Dr. Landau can find more information at www.jungiananalyst.org. And Arlene, again, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure to speak to you.
Well, you as well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.